Today we will start our fifth topic in our number and number sense unit. In this topic, we will learn to convert, compare, and order fractions, decimals, and percents. You have done some of these skills last year, but we will build on them in 7th grade. And we'll start by having you open up your notebook to your pink divider. We want to make sure that you have everything caught up and written down at this point. This will also help you when you're looking to do an activity or an assignment on Blackboard, because you can find those same topics within your notebook. So for the first topic was NS1, which was absolute value. Topic 2, NS2, was perfect squares and square roots. Our third topic was powers of 10 with negative exponents. And our fourth topic that we just finished was scientific notation. Those were the first 4 topics of this unit, and that's what you just took the quiz on. Now that you have taken the quiz, you want to take the time to self-assess how comfortable you feel with these topics. Are you so comfortable with the topic that you can do the work independently and maybe explain it to somebody else that is still having trouble with it? Or can you do it independently, but maybe not reach the point where you're helping other people with it? Or do you need more time? Are you still struggling with that topic and need a little bit extra help before you take your unit test? So I want you to pause this for a moment, think about the types of questions that you saw on your quiz and how you feel about each of those 4 topics. Then you're going to make sure to write down your 5th topic. NS5 is convert, compare, and order FDP, and that's what we're beginning today. To start out, we want to make sure that we know how to convert a fraction to a decimal to a percent and back the other direction. If I'm going to convert a number from a fraction to a decimal, I would start by taking the numerator, or top number in the fraction, and dividing it by the denominator, or the bottom number in the fraction. So that may look like a fraction like this: numerator, top number, divided by denominator, or the bottom number. So that fraction bar would act as your division symbol. Or you could see it with long division, where you would see the numerator inside the house and the denominator outside that you're dividing by. Now, if I want to go from a decimal to a percent, that is essentially multiplying by 100. Now, the thing here is that we are not going to have a calculator. So an easy way to multiply by 100 without a calculator is a lot like what we did with powers of 10 and scientific notation. We're going to move our decimal place. Each time we multiplied by 10 for scientific notation, we moved the decimal 1 place each time we multiplied by 10. Well, multiplying by 100 is like multiplying by 10 twice. So we're going to move our decimal 2 places to the right. So again, since multiplying by 100 is the same as multiplying by 10 2 times, you move the decimal point 2 times to the right, because your number is getting bigger when you're multiplying by 100. So here's your decimal point. You would take 2 jumps to the right, and your new spot would be where you end up. Now to go back the other direction, if I wanted to go from a percent back to a decimal, I'm going to divide by 100. If I'm dividing by 100, I'm kind of working backwards or undoing what I did when I multiplied by 100. So I'm still going to move my decimal point, and I'm still going to move it 2 places. But this time, I'm going to move the decimal 2 places to the left. So if here's my decimal point, I'm going to take 1, 2 jumps to the left, and write my new decimal point where I end up. And the last part of this chart is looking at how you would convert a decimal to a fraction. And there's 3 things you have to write down for this. 3 steps, if you will. First step is to say it. Say the fraction. Read the fraction using your place value. 1/10, 2 hundredths, 3 thousandths. So you're going to say it. Then you need to write it. Write it as a fraction. And then you simplify it, if possible. So if you have something like 2/10, that can simplify to 1/5. If you have something like 50 hundredths, that can simplify to 1/2. Say it, write it, simplify it. Since we need to either memorize or work out by hand long division these fractions to convert them to decimals, there's ways that we can remember tricks for some of them. Some of them you'll just have to use long division, but if you know which ones you have to use long division and which ones have tricks, then you can save yourself a little bit of time. So to start out, we're going to look at halves. That's the denominator that you're kind of looking at the denominator of each fraction. And of course, halves, there's only one example, right, of halves. It's 1/2 or it's 2 halves, which is a whole. So 1/2 would be the only example we would have. And since there's only 1/2 that you have to memorize, it's probably just easier to memorize the value itself, but sometimes we can think in terms of money with some of these. So if you think in terms of money, you can think about the fact that half of $1 is 50 cents, and you write that 0.5, and then you normally have the 0 there because with money you go out through the hundredths place. But 50 cents, 0.50, I can drop that last 0 and just have 0.5. So little trick to help you remember what half is as a decimal. This is all of these are going from a fraction to a decimal. These are the tricks, okay? Now for thirds, I have 1/3 or I have 2/3. Of course, 3/3 would be a whole. So I have 2 options for my fractions. And these are always going to be repeating decimals. These are ones, since there's only 2 of them, that I generally would just memorize. And that is 1/3 is 0.3, repeating, so you draw that bar over the 3 to show that it repeats, and 2/3 is 0.6 repeating, and you draw that bar over the 6 to show that they're repeating. So some of these are also more common. You're probably more likely to memorize them because you've seen them more frequently. When I move on to fourths, I have 1/4 or 3/4. The reason I didn't list 2/4 is because 2/4 was simplified to a half, and then you could use the rule for converting 1/2 to a decimal. So 1/4 or 3/4. And with these, again, I normally think of money and I think of quarters, right? Like the money quarters, because a quarter is 25 cents, right? So 1/4 is 25 cents, and you would write that as 0.25. Or 3/4 of $1 would be 75 cents. And if you kind of ignore that dollar sign out in front and just look at the decimal portion, that decimal is how you convert the fraction to a decimal. So 1/4 is 0.25 or 25 cents. 3/4 is 0.75 or 75 cents. When I go on to fifths, I'd have 1/5, 2/5, 3/5, or 4/5. The only one I don't have is 5/5 because that's a whole. So none of the fifths would be simplified to anything else. For fifths, I'll have to show you, it's called the hands trick, and it's a way to help you remember how to basically count by 1/5 at a time using decimals. One thing that can also kind of goes along with that hands trick is if you just remember what 1/5 is equal to. 1/5, if you remember, is 0.2 or 20%. Then each fifth that you have, you just add another 0.2 or another 20%. So that's essentially how that works. If you remember 1/5, then you can very quickly figure out 2, 3, or 4/5 by repeatedly adding that decimal or that percent. So we will talk about that in class. For sixth, we're only going to have two different fractions for this, 1/6 and 5/6, because all of the other ones can be simplified. 2/6 simplifies to a third, so then I use a trick for thirds. 3/6 simplifies to a half, so I use the trick for 1/2. 4/6 simplifies to 2/3, so I'm using the trick for thirds. So these are the only 6 that cannot be simplified to something else. 6, unfortunately, are going to involve long division, but there's only 2 of them, so they might be a little bit easier to memorize, and they also are going to be repeating decimals when you divide. Moving on to sevenths, I would have all of the sevenths, right, because none of them can simplify. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 sevenths. And these are fun because you can only use long division. And they don't repeat, but they do continue on. If you were to divide this out with long division, you would never reach a point where you didn't need to add a 0 and carry it down. So for the purpose of 7th grade, basically you just want to go out to about the thousands place, so 3 digits after the decimal if you ever have to long divide. That way, if you're having to compare things, you've gone out 3 decimal places and you would not have a question that would require you to go further than that with any of the comparing or ordering that we will do later. So even though So you use long division, but unlike some of the other ones that involve long division, they do not repeat, but it does not terminate. So I will squeeze this in here, or does not end. Terminate or end means the same thing basically, so it would continue on. For eighths, we basically have the odd numerators, 1/8, 3/8, 5/8, and 7/8, because all of the even numerators would be able to be simplified. And I just realized a typo. This should be eighths with an H there. Okay. Now, I will write something down and we will discuss it in class. But you just need to remember 2, 5, 7, 5. That's a 7. And this is what you're writing down. 2, 5, 7, 5. So we'll discuss that in class, but this is what you're writing in your notebook right now. It would be a lot to try and write on this line if we went into detail right now. 2, 5, 7, 5, 2, 5, 7, 5. All right, moving on to ninths. So you would have all of the ninths because, well, no, I'm sorry. You would have a lot of the ninths. 3/9 simplifies to a third, and 6/9 simplifies to 2/3. So you are missing a couple of them because they simplify. When you simplify ninths, they are all repeating decimals. But there's a great trick for this. And the trick is it's the numerator that repeats. So for example, 4/9 is 0.444444 repeating. 5/9, this should be a 9. 5/9 would be 0.555555555 repeating. So whatever the numerator is for the fraction when you're dealing with ninths, that numerator is the repeating decimal. So it's actually pretty easy. You don't have to do long division. For tenths, 1/10, 3/10, 7/10, 9/10. Again, I've taken out all of the even numerators because they would simplify, and 5/10 because I would simplify to a half. So I'm only left with 4 fractions. And this trick will work for all of your tenths, even the ones that aren't listed. But basically, the numerator is after the decimal. Because when you're dealing with a denominator that is also a place value, your numerator just goes in that place value. So the numerator is after the decimal. So 1/10 is 0.1. 2/10, though I don't have it listed here, would be 0.2. 3/10, 0.3, and so on. All right, 11s. There are a lot of them here. You will have to write them small, and you'll have to kind of squeeze them probably in a couple of lines here in this box. None of the 11s simplify, so you have all of them. But there is a trick, and I didn't learn this until I started teaching 7th grade math. I never knew this in school myself. But basically the trick is that you take your numerator and you multiply it by 9. And that, once you do that, is the repeating decimal. So, for example, if I wanted to look at 3/11, the numerator of 3 times 9 is 27. So you would have 0.27272727. So the 2 and the 7 both keep repeating. So it's a little bit different. Instead of just one number repeating, it's a couple numbers that kind of alternately repeat. Like you have the 27 repeatedly instead of just a 2 or just a 7 that repeats. But you'll see some examples of that in class. And moving on to 12ths, because a lot of these simplify, we only have 1/12, 5/12, 7/12, and 11/12. These will be repeating and you will want to use long division. So it's a good thing that a lot of them do simplify because it saves you a lot of work if you can figure out how they simplify. So we're putting this in our notebook to help us with if we can memorize some of these tricks, then life can be a little bit easier for us on these non-calculator sections. Otherwise, you'd have to do long division for everything. If you don't have a calculator, you need to turn fraction to a decimal, you would just have to do like our chart that was above this we put in our notes. Like our chart said, numerator divided by denominator for everything. But if you can either memorize what the decimal is when you convert it, make some flashcards with index cards at home or something, or memorize these tricks, there will only be a handful of fractions you would actually have to divide out by hand using long division.